wild bobcats curled peacefully against a woman on a concrete floor. But the truth behind it is anything but peaceful. All three were dying, not from their injuries, but from trauma so deep that every rehabilitation protocol had failed. The woman did the one thing no manual suggests. She laid a blanket on the concrete floor and made herself as still as stone. She didn't do it because she wanted to. She did it because they wouldn't have survived otherwise. This is the story behind a photograph that stopped strangers mid-scroll. Not a stunt, not a cuddle, but a last attempt to tether three fading lives to the promise of morning. And how a steady human heartbeat became the last hope for three wild souls who had forgotten how to live. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Sarah Mitchell had run the Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in the mountains of Colorado for 15 years. She'd bottle-fed orphaned black bears, nursed gunshot eagles back to flight, and taught countless raccoon kits how to forage. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared her for the night that photograph was taken, or the three small lives that forever changed how she understood the bridge between wildness and trust. The storm that brought them to her started weeks before the first drop of rain fell. It began with a phone call from a state trooper named Officer Rodriguez on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. A motorist had spotted something moving beside Highway 285, near the scorched remains of last month's wildfire zone. When Rodriguez investigated, he found a bobcat kitten, maybe 8 weeks old, pressed against the cold body of his mother. She'd been hit by a vehicle sometime in the night. The kit was hypothermic, dehydrated, and wouldn't leave her side. "He fought me when I tried to pick him up," Rodriguez told Sarah over the phone, his voice thick with something she recognized. That particular ache that comes from witnessing raw grief in something so small. Drew blood through my gloves. But Sarah, he was dying out there. Another few hours and... Sarah named him Ember, for the fire that had driven his family from their territory and onto the dangerous highway corridor. When Rodriguez brought him to the rehabilitation center wrapped in his jacket, the kitten was barely responsive. His body temperature had dropped to 94 degrees, dangerously low for a bobcat kit. His eyes, when they briefly opened, held a wildness that went beyond fear. It was the look of something that had witnessed the unthinkable and couldn't process a world where mothers simply stopped moving. Sarah had been working to stabilize Ember for exactly 3 days when the second call came. This time, it was from Margaret Thompson, a rancher whose property bordered the national forest. Her dogs had been barking incessantly at a collapsed den near the creek bed. When she investigated, she discovered the remains of what had once been a sturdy burrow, likely undermined by the recent heavy rains that followed the drought. Inside, barely breathing, was another bobcat kitten, a female, slightly smaller than Ember. "The mother must have been hunting," Margaret said when she delivered the kit to Sarah, her weathered hands gentle despite their strength. Den collapsed while she was gone. We found her tracks all around. She'd been digging for hours trying to get back in. But Sarah, she never came back after we extracted the baby. It's been 2 days now. Sarah called her Echo for the way she cried constantly those first nights, calling and calling for a mother who couldn't answer. She was malnourished, her ribs visible beneath her spotted coat, her paw pads raw from her own attempts to dig out. Unlike Ember's shocked silence, Echo's grief was vocal, piercing, impossible to ignore. She refused every bottle, turned away from every dish of formula, and grew weaker by the hour. It was past midnight on the 5th day as Sarah sat between their 2 heated crates in the isolation room when her phone rang again. This time, it was Dr. James Harrison from the emergency veterinary clinic in town. Flash flooding had torn through Beaver Creek Canyon. A couple hiking the aftermath had found a bobcat kitten, nearly drowned, tangled in debris along what used to be the creek bank. "Sarah, I've done what I can," Dr. Harrison said, exhaustion clear in his voice. "He's stable, but barely. Maybe 6 weeks old, younger than typical orphans. He's not doing well. The trauma, the near drowning, the hypothermia, his nervous system took a hit. He's having episodes, almost like panic attacks. Honestly, I don't know if he'll make it, but if anyone can pull him through." Sarah named him Storm, and when Dr. Harrison delivered him at dawn, she understood immediately why the vet had been so pessimistic. This kit was beyond traumatized. He seized at any sound louder than a whisper. His breathing was erratic. His eyes, when open, darted constantly, never focusing, never settling. He'd been underwater long enough that oxygen deprivation might have caused permanent damage. Every few minutes, his small body would stiffen and he'd cry out. A sound Sarah had never heard from any bobcat before, wild or captive. It was pure, primal terror. 3 broken kittens, 3 different traumas, 3 wild souls who had learned too young that the world could shatter without warning. And none of them were thriving. By the end of the first week with all 3, Sarah was watching them fade. The heated crates, the carefully prepared formula, the quiet environment, none of her usual techniques were working. Ember remained catatonic, eating only when force-fed with a syringe. Echo's cries had grown weaker, her refusal to eat absolute. And Storm cycled between rigid panic and exhausted collapse, his neurological symptoms worsening with each episode. Sarah had rehabilitated hundreds of animals, but she'd never faced this. 3 kittens simultaneously shutting down, their grief and trauma creating a spiral she couldn't break. She called every wildlife rehabilitation expert she knew. She tried different formulas, different feeding techniques, different enclosure setups. Nothing worked. It was Dr. Patricia Williams, Sarah's mentor from her early days in wildlife rehabilitation, who said something that changed everything. "Sarah," she said during their late-night phone call, her voice gentle but firm, "sometimes the medicine isn't medical. These babies didn't just lose their mothers, they lost their entire understanding of safety. You can't bottle feed them trust. Sometimes you have to show them what survival looks like." That night, October 15th, as another storm system rolled through the Rockies, Sarah did something she'd never done in 15 years of wildlife rehabilitation. Something that went against every protocol she'd been taught about maintaining professional boundaries with wild animals. She moved the 3 kittens from their separate crates into the large recovery pen usually reserved for older juveniles. Then she grabbed the old Army surplus blanket kept for emergencies, the one that had been with the rehabilitation center since the beginning, and she lay down on the pen floor. Her heart hammered as she settled onto the concrete, acutely aware that even young bobcats have claws designed to shred and teeth meant to kill. These 3 were traumatized, essentially feral, and had shown nothing but fear and aggression toward human contact beyond basic medical care. She was either about to break through or become another trauma in their already shattered worlds. Sarah made herself as still as mountain stone. She controlled her breathing, slow, steady, rhythmic. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything except exist in their space. The storm outside crescendoed, thunder rolling through the valley like drums, and she lay there, offering nothing but presence. Ember was the first to approach. For 20 minutes, he stayed in his corner, those golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Then, step by careful step, he came closer. He didn't climb into her arms or seek comfort. He simply stood there, maybe 18 inches away, watching, listening to her heartbeat, testing the air around her for threat or safety. Minutes stretched like hours. Her arm was going numb where she lay on it, but she didn't dare adjust. Then, just as the rain began to pound against the metal roof, Ember lay down. Not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the tiny puffs of his exhales. It was the first time since his rescue that he'd voluntarily relaxed in the presence of a human. Echo joined an hour later. Her approach was different, sudden, almost desperate. One moment she was pressed against the far wall, the next she was curled tight against Sarah's ribs, her small body vibrating with purrs so intense they seemed to surprise her. She pressed her face into Sarah's shirt and finally stopped crying for her mother. The silence was profound. Storm took the longest. He paced the perimeter of the pen until nearly 3 a.m., his movements erratic, his breathing harsh. Several times he approached, only to bolt back to his corner when thunder crashed overhead. Sarah fought to stay awake, to maintain that steady presence he clearly wanted to trust but couldn't quite manage. Then, as the storm began to wane and the first hints of dawn touched the windows, Storm did something that made Sarah's eyes burn with tears she couldn't shed without disturbing them. He walked directly to her, placed one small paw on her leg, the first touch he'd initiated since his rescue, and looked her directly in the eyes. In that gaze was a question anyone could understand. "Will you leave too?" Sarah barely breathed as he climbed over her leg, settled into the curve of her arm, and began to purr. It was broken, that purr, stuttering and uncertain, nothing like Echo's desperate vibration or the subtle rumble Ember had started. But it was there. 3 broken creatures, each with wounds no medicine could touch, had found one thing that told them the world might be safe again. The steady rhythm of a living presence that wouldn't abandon them. That should have been the end of it. One night of breakthrough, then back to normal rehabilitation protocols. But when Sarah tried to leave the next morning, Storm began seizing. Echo resumed her heartbreaking cries. Ember retreated so deeply into himself that he wouldn't even open his eyes. The progress they'd made evaporated like morning mist. So she went back that night, and the next, and the next. It became their ritual, those nights curled together on that old army blanket. As the sun set and their stress naturally surged, a vestige of their wild instincts, Sarah would enter the pen with her blanket and lie down. Each night they came to her faster. Each night they settled closer. By the end of the first week, Ember had claimed her arm as his pillow, his head heavy with trust. Echo draped herself across Sarah's chest, her paw always reaching to rest over her heart, as if ensuring it kept beating. And Storm, traumatized, neurologically damaged Storm, tucked himself into the crook of her neck, his whiskers tickling her chin, his purr finally steady and strong. Yes, Sarah barely slept those nights. Her back ached from the concrete floor. Her arm would go numb under Ember's weight. She'd wake with whiskers in her nose and sometimes a tail across her face. But every morning she could see the changes. Their eyes grew brighter. Their coats, dull with stress, began to shine. They started eating on their own. First Storm, then Echo, finally Ember. They began to play, tentatively at first, then with the rough and tumble enthusiasm that Bobcat kits should have. The photograph that would later circulate on social media, the one showing all three of them curled against Sarah in perfect peace, was taken on night number 37 by her assistant, Rebecca Martinez, who'd come to check on them during a particularly severe storm. She found them there, lit only by the emergency lighting. 3 wild hearts and 1 human, breathing in synchronization. "My God, Sarah," Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Do you realize what you've done?" But Sarah hadn't done anything except show up. Night after night, she'd simply been present. She'd offered them the one thing their trauma had stolen: the absolute certainty that some things in this world could be trusted to remain. By December, they were different creatures entirely. Ember had grown bold, becoming the leader of their small pack. Echo's cries had transformed into playful chatter, and she'd become the most skilled hunter of the 3, catching every cricket that dared enter their pen. And Storm, miracle of miracles, his neurological symptoms had all but disappeared. Dr. Harrison called it unprecedented recovery. But Sarah knew better. It wasn't medical intervention that had healed him. It was consistency, safety, the knowledge that when the sun set and the scary shadows grew long, someone would be there. The hardest part was knowing when to stop. Wild animals that become too attached to humans can never return to the wild, and that had always been the goal. These 3 belonged to the mountains, not to a rehabilitation center. So gradually, Sarah began to reduce their contact. First, she'd stay only until they fell asleep, then slip away. Then she'd lie down for just an hour, then 30 minutes. Then she'd simply sit beside them rather than lie down. They protested at first, especially Storm, whose anxiety resurfaced with each change. But Sarah introduced them to enrichment activities that didn't involve her. Hidden food that required hunting, climbing structures that mimicked their natural habitat, recorded sounds of wild bobcats that taught them their own language. Rebecca and Sarah began taking them on supervised explorations of the outdoor enclosure, letting them discover that the world beyond human presence could be exciting rather than terrifying. By February, they were ready for the soft-release pen, a half-acre enclosure that bridged the gap between captivity and wild. They could hunt live prey, humanely sourced mice and rabbits, climb real trees, and experience weather without walls. Sarah watched them from a distance, her chest tight with pride and something else, a grief she hadn't expected. The final night before their release, Sarah broke her own protocol one last time. She brought the old army blanket to the soft-release pen and lay down under the stars. They came to her immediately, as if they knew. They spent that night the way they'd spent so many others, entwined, purring, breathing as one. But there was something different in the way they settled against her. It felt like goodbye. March 15th, the first truly warm day of spring, the rehabilitation team opened the gate to the soft-release pen. Sarah stood 50 yards away, hidden behind a blind, her hands shaking with emotion she couldn't quite name. Ember went first, bold as always, his stride confident. Echo followed, pausing once to look back, her ear tufts twitching in what Sarah chose to believe was acknowledgement. Storm hesitated longest, standing at the threshold between the known and unknown. For a moment, it seemed he might turn back, might choose safety over freedom. Then a butterfly, the first of spring, fluttered past the gate. Storm's instincts fired, and he pounced after it, bounding into the wild with a joy Sarah had never seen from him before. Within minutes, all three had disappeared into the tree line. They didn't look back. That was exactly as it should be. Sarah still has that blanket. It sits folded on a shelf in her office, still carrying the faint scent of wild things and difficult nights. Sometimes, when storms roll through Pine Ridge and the rehabilitation center is full of new orphans, new traumas, new broken hearts, she takes it down and remembers. The truth behind that famous photograph isn't just about a woman who slept with bobcats. It's about understanding that sometimes healing requires breaking the rules. It's about recognizing that trauma in any species can only be overcome when someone proves that not everything in the world leaves. It's about the profound responsibility humans have to the wild things whose lives they've disrupted, and the lengths that must be taken to make them whole again. People often ask if Sarah ever sees them, her three midnight companions. The answer is both yes and no. She's never seen them directly since their release. That would mean they're too comfortable with humans, which would be a failure. But she finds their tracks sometimes, out near Beaver Creek where Storm nearly drowned. She's found Echo's distinctive scratch marks on a territory marker tree. And once, during a particularly severe spring storm, muddy paw prints appeared on her porch. 3 sets, different sizes, leading to her door and then away again. Beside the prints was a single butterfly wing, iridescent blue, placed precisely where it couldn't be missed. Sarah keeps that wing pressed between the pages of her rehabilitation journal, right next to the photograph Rebecca took that night. When people see the image and say it's beautiful, she agrees. But she also tells them the truth, that beauty was born from trauma. Trust was built one terrifying night at a time, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching something wild to leave you behind. The blanket still waits on its shelf, ready for the next broken heart that needs to learn the world can be trusted again. And on storm-dark nights, when the thunder rolls through Pine Ridge and the rehabilitation center fills with frightened cries, Sarah remembers 3 kittens who taught her that sometimes the medicine isn't medical. Sometimes it's just showing up, lying down, and proving with every breath that not everything in this world abandons you when you need it most. That's the truth behind the photograph. That's why Sarah Mitchell slept with bobcats every night for 43 nights straight. Not because she wanted to, but because they wouldn't have survived otherwise. And when they were ready, fully wild again, no longer needing her warmth, they left her behind. That was the goal all along. The success of wildlife rehabilitation is measured not in the bonds formed, but in the wild animal's ability to break them. Every wildlife rehabilitator knows this truth. The heartbreak of goodbye is the price of giving something wild its life back. On stormy nights, when the rain pounds against the metal roof of the rehabilitation center, and new orphans cry for mothers who will never return, Sarah sometimes walks past that shelf where the blanket waits. She runs her fingers across its worn fabric, remembering the weight of 3 small bodies, the rumble of healing purrs, the moment when trust first flickered in traumatized eyes. The rehabilitation center has seen many successes since then. Eagle releases that drew crowds, bear cubs that made the local news, a mountain lion kit whose recovery became a documentary. But nothing has ever matched those 43 nights with Ember, Echo, and Storm. Nothing has ever required such a complete abandonment of professional protocol, such a deep dive into the space between human and wild. Dr. Patricia Williams, Sarah's mentor, visited the center the following summer. She stood in the pen where it had all happened, now housing a recovering fox kit, and shook her head in wonder. "You know what you did was unprecedented," she said. "There's no manual for what you accomplished here. You wrote your own." But Sarah knew the truth was simpler than that. She hadn't written anything new. She'd simply remembered something ancient. That healing happens in the space between heartbeats, in the moments when one living thing tells another, "You're not alone." The photograph continues to circulate on social media, shared thousands of times with captions about the beauty of interspecies connection. Conservation organizations use it in their fundraising materials. Wildlife photography magazines have requested the rights to publish it. But for Sarah, it remains something else entirely. A reminder of the night when 3 broken kittens taught her that sometimes the bravest thing isn't letting go. Sometimes it's holding on just long enough for something wild to remember how to be free.